Thanks, Jose, for the nice video. It's the first time I saw it. Very well done. So what I'm going to do today is not give you a pitch on nLIGHT. We're a high-power semiconductor fiber laser manufacturer. Rather, I'm going to talk about some of my reflections, maybe musings on our industry. And I'm going to cover 3 points. The first one is just to be humble, to get grounded. You know, we're an industry that is relatively small compared to the tech giants, but I'm going to assert very, very important, which leads me to my second point. We all talk about, changes in the global economy. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, other than just to try to make the point that my perspective is those changes are more profound and longer lasting and more fundamental than I think even many of us generally believe. And then finally, I think then that tees up really important questions for us as leaders. And I'll talk about two. One is sort of more of a business one. The second one is more of an ethical question. And we'll come to that. So to get grounded, we're a small industry. Relative to the tech giants out there, we're not on that list. You really have to extend that list, and even there, we're on the far tail of that list. And even a little bit more challenging, I'll just pick a couple companies out of this list you may or may not even know. DoorDash, so I guess delivering Thai food and doing ad tech is more valuable than the work we do, according to Wall Street. And that can be a little bit depressing at times. And in fact, just a quick history of myself. My background is in manufacturing. I worked at McKinsey for a number of years. When I left McKinsey back in 1997, I was looking at, I helped start a company in both of these spaces, actually, and they both were successful. I decided to go into lasers, and my friends at McKinsey thought I was kind of nuts for doing that. And I think the way I think about it is, I think about not only creating value, I do think that shareholder value is a very important goal, but I think doing work that's really important is equally important. And I think what we're doing in photonics generally, and lasers in particular, is very important. If you take the list from just the US and EU, for example, of the critical technology, I would argue that lasers are behind all of these. I won't take the time to go through all of this, but I think you can glance at that list and get the sense of how important many of us in this room are to this entire list. And one way to summarize this is just looking at what lasers do. And I think just to break it down and be a little simplistic here, there are two things we fundamentally do. We manage information or data, and we transfer energy to do work. And I'll start with just on the data side. I think this one is pretty obvious. There's really profound changes going on that I think we'll be talking about. Many are focused on. Lasers behind that. Second, on the transferring energy side, it's an area where I've spent relatively more time. We do both. And this is, doing material processing of a wide range, from cutting metal to welding to additive manufacturing to a whole host of microprocessing applications. But I'll start with just a quick video. You can see this from YouTube. Rafael is a leader in this space. Oh, it's working good. This is the video that they released just a couple weeks ago on using lasers to defend against drones. We're all talking about it. I'd encourage you can go look at the YouTube site, and you can see more there. And so I think there's a lot going on there, but there's a lot going on elsewhere in the world also, and we'll come back to this point. So in this space, again, we need to see profound improvements in the technology, and we're seeing that. This is a plot of the highest power single mode lasers that are needed in order to support these applications. So we're seeing exponential improvement here also. And to summarize, behind, I think, these applications is the semiconductor laser. And just to go back in time to what Hall came up with in '62, there's been profound changes. And I just want to note that, a few years after that, that's when Gordon Moore published his paper. And I encourage everybody just to download this paper. It's really short. And I think it's something that is often misunderstood, that Gordon Moore was asserting some law. It wasn't. But it was his musings on what was going on. And it's worth reading this. There's really only one figure in his paper, which he had sort of 5 data points, and he didn't predict, he sort of suggested that maybe this will remain constant. And as we all know, it did for quite some time. It's now morphing into different ways of thinking about Moore's law. But I think the point I want to make is that semiconductor lasers, we had sort of 5 data points that we used when we started nLIGHT in 2000. And similarly, we have focused on cramming more photons into fiber for doing various applications. And we're seeing that enable these growing markets. So markets have grown. It's been a really exciting time across a wide range of applications that I won't go into details of all those. The thing I want to focus on now is just how our markets have changed in the context of the global economy. So if you take this is just high power lasers, this market, and break it into China and the rest of the world, you get something like this, roughly 50-50 maybe, just depends on how you think about it. If you then convert that into, instead of dollars or euros, if you convert it into volume or megawatts, you get something that's even more profound, something like that. So roughly, it may be a factor of 10. And if you look at that compared to other industries, lasers, maybe high-power lasers, maybe it's 90-10, something like that. Drones, similar, batteries, et cetera. It's only when we get into a few other segments that you get a different mix. And I think that represents an important set of challenges. It's not per se good or bad, but it represents significant challenges. And the challenge that I'd like to emphasize here is a quote from Andy Grove. Quote from 2010 about the importance of scale. So in discrete manufacturing, there are scale economies, and it's important. I think in process manufacturing, like semiconductors, they can be quite profound, and I think that's the point that Andy was trying to make here. And I think in our industry, this is important. And we're familiar with the sort of volume cost curves. So volume is important for cost. But I think in addition to that, you get sort of quality and even performance curves that you simply don't have a real product until you have some scale. And then as you continue to ramp that scale, that product gets better and better. So volume matters. It matters a lot. Where that minimum efficient scale is depends on the industry, depends on all kinds of particulars. But nevertheless, there's this fundamental challenge that is faced as volume, there's a difference in volume. So, and I think losing that ability to scale is related to how well we innovate. And I think that's a point that I know at least in Washington, D.C. is not as well understood as it could be. I'm sort of advocating that we all need to think about this. So with that, then, come to the more specific challenges that I see from the global economy. And again, I don't want to sort of retread all kinds of basic facts, but what I want to get across is that, at least my point of view, is that these changes are more profound and more lasting than I think many imagine. So first, I think we all know that the global manufacturing mix has changed dramatically. By the way, in my career, I started my career back in the 80s doing manufacturing, a lot of work in China, and so it's been really exciting for me to work with colleagues in China and see this incredible growth that's occurred from sort of nothing, certainly in tech, to I think China today represents, or the manufacturing output from China is something like equal to the next 10 countries combined. It's massive, and it's a massive change in a relatively short period of time. So just a quick aside on macro GDP. If you look at the elements of GDP, investment is a key one, and there's various models to drive growth, and investment is an important part. if you look at the U.S. going back last century, we had an investment-led growth economy going way back in time, and then it balanced out at sort of 25%. Japan is a good case study of an investment-led growth model that then rebalanced again in that kind of 25% of GDP sort of territory. So, if you look over time, a balanced economy, again, investment and consumption, investments sort of on the order of 25%. And by the way, that transition, as we all know in Japan, pretty painful transition as you rebalance the economy. So I think that this is a figure of merit that I think is worth monitoring. China has had an investment-led growth model, I think a very successful one. There are huge opportunities for productive investment. But I think what is noteworthy is that the rebalancing that a lot of people talk about, isn't really occurring yet. And under Xi Jinping, there's a sustained investment-led model. And I would assert that a balanced economy would look different over time. Now, as you have significant opportunities for investment with productivity, that makes sense. But as productivity, as you grow an economy, it gets harder and harder to drive productive or to find productive investments. And this is, that's going to play out in China as in any economy as it matures. So as we all know in China, there's been significant investment in real estate, massive excess investment there. There's been investment in infrastructure, incredible, high-speed rail, incredible things, but also, bridges that aren't used that go to nowhere. And then finally, in manufacturing, I would assert, significant excess capacity in a wide range of industries. I'll let you all calculate the data in your particular segment of the industry, but I think that is generally true across a wide range of different industries. So what does that lead to? Well, if you've got excess capacity, you've got to compete to sell it. Well, what do you do to compete to sell? Well, prices change dramatically. In fiber lasers, we've seen sort of 2 orders of magnitude reduction in prices, over the last few decades. So dramatic changes in prices. It gets challenging to build a business. The number of businesses that are actually making money, it's a little hard to tell, but certainly there's been significant growth in the number of companies that are loss-making. What does that lead to? It leads to more tensions around the world, and it leads to, obviously, the tariffs. And I think I think we all know this, we're all suffering from the dynamics and the just incredibly frustrating aspect of the dramatic change in tariffs. Right? We're seeing tariffs now that are at the level that we haven't seen since, the 30s or so. And I think the point I want to make here is, while that's very challenging and it's something we would wish would go away, I would assert that we shouldn't be assuming they're going away. Hopefully there's mitigation here, hopefully this moderates, but at least in our planning, we're not assuming that I think this world has changed, pretty fundamentally. So we get this vicious cycle that is going on, and it is a cycle that has other elements to it, but I think this is a reasonable summary of the dynamics that are playing out. And I guess the point here is that I don't see a clear path to breaking this cycle, certainly in the meaningful future. And what does that mean? The model that we all, I think everybody in this room, grew up under and experienced and really thrived in. It's always challenging. There's always business cycles, but globalization, liberalization, whatever we want to call it, right? I would argue that those days are over. Not a hugely contentious assertion. Whatever we call this, I don't know, multipolar or something else. And the question that comes up often is, is this a replay of the 30s? I don't think so. I think there are fundamental differences between today and the 30s. But history doesn't necessarily repeat, but does it rhyme? Are there lessons to learn? Yes, there's lessons to learn here. And the point I want to make is that we're in a fundamentally different world, in a world in which, this is a quote from Bill Clinton, it's 2001 that I think the world changed really fundamentally, and at the time, There's a tendency now to disparage comments like this from the past, and I wouldn't do that. I think that, Clinton's comments, there's a wide range of other comments from both the left and the right about hope. And certainly I shared that hope in 2001, and I saw dramatic improvements in the world as we liberalized and we had growth. But sitting here today, I don't think this is a rational way to expect how things are going to evolve, and those days are over. So, what does that mean for us? What do we do about that? And I'm going to tee up sort of two topics that I think that we think about at nLIGHT, and I'd encourage more to be thinking about. First one is on sort of strategic decisions, strategic business decisions. Look, I think a China strategy is inherent in, I think, all of our businesses. That strategy is very difficult to navigate. There are a wide range, there's a spectrum of alternatives. This is by no means a complete list, but from top to bottom, I think you see a spectrum of different alternatives that can be pursued. And I think that the gradations and the differences between these are sort of an analog function. There's always a mix here, but I think there are fundamental choices to make across this, and I think it's something that given the size and the change in the global economy, it's something that should be front and center at every single for every single board. Just a quick summary for going back to nLIGHT. And I will, put this out there. This is what we've done. We went public in 2018. Something like roughly 40% of our sales are in China. We're certainly helping and supporting and part of the industrial transformation. China went from nothing to, when I set up shop there in 2003, to the leader in lasers for manufacturing, and we grew with that. In addition to end exposure, the bar chart. The line plots total revenue exposure to manufacturing the supply chain in China. Something like 70% was the number that we calculated back in 2018. So we go public 2018. The same month was a month that there was a decision in China to allow Xi Jinping to take over for a third term. And we're very fortunate. One of my board members was the ambassador to China, who knew Hu Jintao well and is steeped in what's going on. So we actually had a board meeting to talk through, this change. And I think that's a point that I would encourage. I think these sort of geopolitical changes are more relevant than they've been in the past. I mean, we always talk about geopolitics, and certainly at conferences like this, it's interesting over dinner sharing notes. And boards certainly should be talking about it, but I think it's even more important now to really get deep in this. So we made a decision as a board that we said this third term is more meaningful than the world is really picking up, and so we said we're going to pursue the de-risking strategy, which we did. We've grown outside of China, and we've de-risked our supply chain. So that's just one, very sort of summary perspective on a business decision relative to geopolitical changes. I think there's important ethical decisions too, and this one gets always a little more, they should be uncomfortable, right? And challenging, and in no way do I want to be contentious, but I do want to provide some food for thought. And I worked too long at McKinsey, so I've got too many 2x2s, apologize. So this is one. Business success, one dimension, that's necessary. It's not sufficient. I think pursuing a model that is ethical, I think, is requisite. And there's a tendency when we think about ethics to sort of pick a poster child that's just, quote, bad. So Enron is usually picked, right? And I think that doesn't help us. That lower left quadrant is not an instructive place to learn from. In fact, I would encourage everybody, if you're really interested, to go much deeper in Enron and to get into the details, that there's a tendency to draw caricatures of, quote, bad companies, and we don't learn much from that. So I'm going to pick another one. No one here from IBM, maybe not, anyways. And by the way, I'm not going to do this in a contemporary setting because that's too contentious, so we'll go back in time. We'll go back to Watson, when the logo looked like this. When he was building the company, he put forward his strategy, his view, which is one that I think we can find examples of that today. That he was focused on his business. He wasn't into politics. He was into his business. Fine, took a point of view that was fairly stark. And I appreciate the fact that there's this quote that describes that clearly. Well, this is the 30s, right? And he's building tabulating machines, precursors to computers, and they were used for the census. So getting data on people was a challenging thing to do. He was very successful in doing that, not only in the US, but also in Europe. And so there was big demand in Germany. I was meeting with him, with Hitler here. They were very successful. In fact, he won an important award. Here's the medal that he won. He was very appreciative, and here's a letter that he wrote back to Hitler. And I think there's a case study here, which is to say that there are decisions we make that have import, and it's something that is always challenging at the time. It can be very difficult to assess where we sit here. And by the way, if you want this, I do recommend this case, actually. It's not as well read. In my business school experience that we didn't use it, we should have. And I would encourage you all to take a look at it. And I think it's important for boards to be thinking about the ethical decisions of what are we doing, what is our technology doing in the world, and are there decisions that we need to be thinking about that we may not be thinking about today. So with that, I will conclude on my vision is that there's this concept of general purpose disruptive technologies. You can see there's various books and MIT professors that write about this, and the obvious history of fundamental technologies that sit behind the entire economy. Our valuations may not be the same as some ad tech company, but what we do is really vital. And I would assert that lasers and photonics more broadly are absolutely critical disruptive technologies. It's a really hard industry, as I've talked about. There's serious challenges geopolitically, but I think what we do in this room is really vitally important. And it's great to be part of this community and working on these challenges together. So thank you.